We are going to get started with our next panel covering the economic impact of changing demographics, and I'm thrilled to have a really outstanding group here to cover this topic. As many of you know, people are living much longer than they were just a few decades ago. That's certainly good news. But not every country with aging populations has put into place policies that can alleviate stresses on healthcare systems and Social Security programs while planning for the right amount of healthcare for their aging populations. And at the same time that many people are living longer, birth rates have been steadily declining, and that slowed the growth of the labor force, resulted in fewer workers per retiree. Our panelists today are thinking hard about the best policies to tackle these issues, and I know we're going to have a robust dialogue. My friend and colleague, Adrien will be introducing everyone in just a minute, but I first want to welcome him and give him a huge thank you for helping to organize this panel and to serve as its moderator. Adrien is a SIEPR faculty fellow, and he's an assistant professor of economics here at Stanford. His research focuses on inequality, consumption, monetary and fiscal policy, and international economics. His recent work explores the redistributive effects of monetary policy and the role of inequality in affecting the macroeconomy. He and I joined Stanford at about the same time several years ago, and I've enjoyed and benefited tremendously from having him as a colleague. So please join me in welcoming Adrien, who will introduce our panelists. Adrien Auclert.
So, thanks, Mark, for the really kind introduction. So, as Mark said, my name is Adrien Auclert. I'm an assistant professor here. And I study mostly monetary and fiscal policy, but in that context, because demographics is such an overwhelming force, I've studied demographics and its implications for monetary policy. And so our theme is demographics, a changing world. And to introduce this theme, I'll just start with the obvious, which is that the world is undergoing this dramatic demographic change. And we're going to see some incredible numbers from our two panelists today. And so confronted with this fact, macroeconomists have been hard at work studying the implications of demographic change for a large number of macroeconomic outcomes. And the implications are so broad that few people tackle them all at once. So as macroeconomists, we tend to specialize and usually think about a few of these one at a time. So some researchers study the implications of demographic change for labor supply. And it's clear that the entry of baby boomers in the workforce 40 years ago and now their exit has had very big implications for the US workforce. Some study the implications for productivity and for growth. So obviously demographics affects the number of workers that we have around, and so the number of entrepreneurs we have around, as well as the incentives of these entrepreneurs to innovate given the size of the market that they think that they'll face. Some macroeconomists study the age structure of the population. So under Modigliani's famous life cycle hypothesis, there's a certain stability to what people do at ages, but what demographic change does is that it changes how many people there are of different ages, and that in turn has major macroeconomic implications. But some macroeconomists also study the life cycle itself, so questioning the Modigliani hypothesis. Maybe the ages at which we learn, we work, we save, we have children, we start a business, become ill, etc., are also changes as demographic change is unfolding. Right. And so obviously these topics are really kind of fascinating and really interesting by themselves, but they also have a wide range of implications for policy. Right? So to the extent that demographics adversely affects our growth rate, say maybe because we are generating fewer ideas, maybe that affects how we want to think about innovation policy. To the extent that it leaves too few young people in the workforce, that's going to affect our immigration policy. To the extent that we have fewer student rounds or more retirees, that affects education and health policy. Right? And obviously, because more retirees is putting dramatic pressure on our entitlement programs, that's affecting fiscal policy. How do we make Social Security sustainable and so on. Right? And finally, because demographics is affecting the balance between desired savings and desired investment in the economy, it's affecting the rate at which monetary policy should be expecting to set over the long run, the so-called R star in the jargon. And so that's affecting directly how we operate monetary policy. Okay? So today we're very lucky because we have two incredible speakers that together span a large set of these research areas. And as I said, we tend to specialize. Nobody is an expert on every topic, but here we have two speakers that together cover almost all of them. So it's a great honor for me to introduce first Aysegul Sahin. So Aysegul comes from Turkey. She has an undergrad degree in electrical engineering and a PhD from Rochester. And she was at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York for a long time after her PhD, where she was in charge of the labor market analytics team there. And she's now at the University of Texas at Austin. And Aysegul has done very broad work in macro and labor, including very influential work on the trend in the labor share, the cyclicality of participation, the importance of worker-job mismatch for unemployment, the behavior of job seekers, and so on. And she's studied demographics widely, as will be apparent in her presentation. And so Aysegul will focus on these topics related to labor supply, productivity, and entrepreneurship. And then we'll have Andrew Scott. Andrew's a professor at London Business School, coming straight from London. Thanks, Andrew. And a consulting scholar at our Center for Longevity. And he's also had a very broad career in macroeconomics, advised many governments. He's one of the few macroeconomists that actually has a textbook. He has a few textbooks, including Macroeconomics, Understanding the Wealth of Nations with David Miles. And his demographics research has been focusing on longevity, including a very well-known book called The 100-Year Life that he mentioned in his remarks, and then addressing these issues related to the age structure versus the life cycle. Okay, so I'm looking forward to both of your presentations and then to the discussion afterwards. And Aysegul is up next. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Adrien. It's great to be here talking about dual aging in the US labor market. So I know you're thinking, I know we are all aging. This is the youngest moment of our lives currently. But what's the dual part of it, right? So what I want to refer to as dual aging is the aging of us, the workers, the people, as well as aging of firms in the US economy. And you will see that they have been going on at the same time in these parallel trends. So I want to start with the 1990 paper written by our keynote for dinner, Larry Summers and his co-authors in 1990, An Aging Society, Opportunity or Challenge. And it starts by saying that in 1960, a woman entering childbearing ages expected to have 3.6 children. And by 1990, it was 1.9. And this is precisely what happened. And what we are seeing through is a reflection of this increase and decline in fertility. So look at this more formally. Dual aging. So this is the share of population in different age groups. And we like to call 16 to 24-year-olds young, 25 to 54 prime, and 55 plus mature workers. Right? And you can see here that in early 1980s, the fraction on the red part was almost the same size as 55 plus. And look at this going through 1990s. And what we start seeing in the new century is that prime age and younger workers decline, and the share of older mature workers start increasing. And when I look at it in the last 4 years, you can see that the blue one is twice the size of the red one. So for every young worker, now we have 2 workers who are older than 55 years old. So you probably knew about this, but what about the firms? Interestingly, as the share of younger workers decline, the share of younger firms also decline in the US economy. And on the flip side of it, in 1987, 2/3 of the workers were working at firms that have been around for more than 10 years. Now it's 80%. So this is what I refer to as dual aging. It's not only that workers are aging, firms are aging at the same time. So how did we come here? This is what happened. In order to understand what's happening in the US labor market now, even after the pandemic, we really need to go back to the baby boom, the big cohort that was born between 1946 and 1964. And they affect everything in time series, and they make everything look hump-shaped with the hump in 1980s. So that's what I tell my graduate students. If you want to understand why there is this hump shape in time series in the US economy, most of it is related to the baby boom cohort. So the blue line is the growth rate of working age population between 16 and 64. And you can see that it was around 1%, and it peaked around 2% in 1980. Why? This is when the baby boom cohort entered the labor force. And I put here as a reference the red line, which is the growth rate of civilian labor force. I don't have much time to talk about it, but the second important thing that happened to the US labor market was the great gender convergence. Women account for this wedge between the two series because they enter the labor force at very high rates in the 70s, 80s, 90s, then it flattened. And that's when the two time series converge to each other. What I want to argue in the remaining time is that working age population growth rate accounts for most of the changes that we see in participation rate, entrepreneurship, firm dynamics, firm demographics, which is firm size, firm age, job destruction, as well as unemployment. And you will see that some of them are positive developments, where some of them are actually challenges that we are facing. So let's first track the baby boom generation, starting in 1980s. In 1980s, this cohort is between 16 and 34-year-old. And if you look at this carefully, you can see that for each 50-year-old worker in the economy, there were two 20-year-olds. And let's fast forward this. And you can see their movement. It's such a big cohort. And let me take a step back here and stop in 2006. This is when we are entering the Great Recession. As you can see, there was still some time before this cohort hit the retirement age. Even the leading edge was younger than the retirement age. And the reason I'm talking about this is because I want to link this to what has been happening after the pandemic. And when the pandemic happened, we were already right into the retirement ages. In a way, our expectation of going back to where we were in terms of labor supply was a misguided one because of this movement of the baby boom cohort. And this is the participation rate that I've been talking about. And as I mentioned, part of this huge increase is coming from women, but the other part is the baby boom cohort entering the labor force. And you can see the trend here. Even though the pandemic was a major disruption in participation, it's really just accelerated what was expected to happen. And when I say expected, we really expected that. So these are forecasts from Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Fed, Congressional Budget Office, and a lot of academics that predates the pandemic. And you can see that they were all expecting this decline in the participation rate. And right now, we are 1 percentage point below the pre-pandemic levels, and that's exactly what the CBO expected before the pandemic. So the gap that we are seeing is fully attributable to the aging of the baby boom cohort. What about firms? So I told you something really obvious, birth rate decline, that's why we got older. The same thing happened to the firms. Birth rate of firms have been declining in the US economy, and we are in Silicon Valley, but even in Silicon Valley, we see the effects of this. And as a result of this declining birth rates, firms have been getting older. And this is actually pretty stark. In 1980s, 4% of workers were working for startups. Now it's only 2%. So it's only the half. And why is this happening? Of course, you could think about regulation, lack of ideas, decline in immigration. But the main reason that we now agree is driving this is the declining population growth rate. These are working age growth rate population rates at state level looking at 20-year averages, and I'm looking at the startup rate at these states. You can see California, Texas, Arizona are on the top. They have higher working age population growth rate and higher entrepreneurship. Why? We need labor supply in order to set up our companies. And also, a younger population is more experimental in innovation, in products, in trying new varieties. So all of these factors make the startup rate decline a consequence of the declining working age population. And you can see here, when I put the declining startup rate, it coincides with the timing of the declining working age population growth rate. So another interesting thing is, as we get older, we tend to gain weight. The same thing happens to firms, right? And firms are older now, but they're also bigger. As a result of this, in 1980s, for 100 workers, there were 5 firms on average. Now it's only 4. So concentration is rising. And a PhD student of mine actually showed that this is reducing dynamism in the labor market because there are less options for workers to move to. So this is all the negative effects. What about the positive effects? I define myself as older and more stable. The same thing happens to firms. Job destruction rates are half if you make it to age 10. And similarly, a younger worker is 9 times more likely to become unemployed compared to someone who is older than 55 years old. So this is reducing unemployment rate. And the effect is quite big. Again, hump-shaped plot. In 1980s, we had 5% on average probability of entering into unemployment. Now it's half of that. And the secular trend of unemployment, Adrien mentioned R star, my star is the U star. It's been declining because of the demographic change we see in the economy. And that's why, despite this big increase during the pandemic, we are now at 3.4% unemployment rate. So I want to end by going back to where I started from. In my view, an aging society is both a challenge and an opportunity. And I hope you have seen some of the positives and negatives. Thank you.
Can I just ask the AV team, the timer's slipped down so we can't see it, so I don't know if you can possibly just raise it, so otherwise I'll be taking up the rest of your life talking about this, so I don't know if someone can just lift it up. Thank you very much for the organisers for inviting me here. It's a real privilege to be here. I'm always really happy to talk about my work on the economics of longevity, and that gets me into all sorts of problems when I'm in the supermarket or the airline, but it's great to be doing it in front of this audience. And what I want to try and do is tell you a little bit about my work, and there's a number of people doing a similar vein. And what I think I'm trying to do is develop an alternative to the aging society story. Since I was an undergraduate, and by the way, I'm 57, so this is a very mature talk I'm going to be giving you. I'm obviously no longer prime, but I think my best work is still to come, actually, but there we go. I'm going to try and focus not upon changes in the age structure of the population, but changes in how we age. And I'm going to focus around that concept of longevity, and I've called my talk the evergreen agenda because, I wasn't expecting to be there. The evergreen agenda because it's really important now, given these life expectancy trends, that we change how we age and we age better. And so rather than just focus on a story that is possibly incomplete, changes in the age structure, and time is misleading, I'm going to focus on changes in how we age and how can we seize the advantage of these longer lives. So let me begin with a very familiar chart. This is a world population chart, the United Nations, and it shows you from 1950 out to 2100 forecasts of the world population. This is sort of standard meat and drink for demographers. And what this chart is normally used for is for 2 purposes. The first is to show you, wow, look how big the increase in the world population has been. You're probably aware at the end of last year, the world population reached 8 billion. So a baby was born in Indonesia who was the 8th billionth member of the world. I always wonder how they work out it was in Indonesia, but that's kind of not really the point of what I'm talking about here. But wow, 8 billion people. And the second thing this diagram is used for is you draw a horizontal line across at an arbitrary age, I said I'm 57, so let's choose 58 or 60, whatever it might be. And everyone above that is old. And of course, what this shows you is a rising number of old people and a rising proportion of old people. And that clearly is going to have fundamental implications for how we behave. This trend, by the way, has been happening for over 120 years in the UK. The proportion of people aged over 65 has been rising. And what I find always interesting when I look at our equivalent, the Congressional Budget Office, is the first chapter on future economic trends is always about the number of old people. When I pick up a history book about the last 100 years, I never see anything about the rising number of old people over the last 100 years. So, as Auguste Comte once said, demography is not destiny. There are other changes that can happen. And it may well be changes in how we age. And so this, for me, is the key chart. Forgive me for hitting you with this one. These are what are called survival curves. And they show you it for the UK. These are UK government survival curves. They were produced just before COVID. And they make projections about future life expectancy trends. And the projection is that they're going to start to slow down. They didn't see COVID coming, but they're saying that historical trends will no longer repeat themselves, but they'll be about half as strong. And what is remarkable about this chart is the probability of the young and middle-aged becoming the old. So you can see these remarkable achievements. By the way, the area under these curves is life expectancy, so you can see this tremendous increase in life expectancy. You can see this phenomenal achievement whereby, you used to see a large number of children in the first 5 years of life die. By the way, I was born in 1965 in the UK. The most common age of death in the UK was less than 1 in 1965. I was an identical twin. So in my lifetime, our lifetime has literally changed, because now the most common age of death, even in the midst of COVID, is 87. So that's quite a phenomenal increase in life expectancy. But what you can see is that the probability of a newborn reaching to 60 or 70 is now incredibly high. And according to this data from the UK government, and the UK is not great at life expectancy compared to many other countries, a newborn child today has a 50% chance of living into their early 90s. We've never had that before. We've never had that expectation. Of course, there's been older people before, but it's been a 10 or 20% chance of getting there. But when it's a 50 or 60% chance of getting there, any economist would tell you, you've got to invest much more in your future. You've got to do things differently. So this longevity for me is about two key aspects. One is about time. We have more time. And I think that's a great thing. Now, of course, the aging society story always kind of tells you that time is at the end of your life. But as I hope those charts just showed you, it's about all of life. You've got time over all of life. And in my book, The 100-Year Life, that I wrote with Linda Grattan, we focus on particularly what this means for careers and are moving away from a three-stage life of education, work, retirement to something more multi-staged, including working for longer. But what this chart shows you is if you ignore the first 20 years of life and ignore the last 10 years of life, I'll give you a weekend and some evenings off. Let's call everything else productive hours, something you could be doing your time with, not necessarily working. If you go from 70 to 100, you've got an extra 100,000 hours. And so the exam question, ladies and gentlemen, is what do you want to do with another 70,000 or 100,000 hours? How do we use that time? And of course, with more time ahead of us, we are aging differently. Laura Carstensen here at Stanford runs the New Map of Life initiative, the Stanford Longevity Center. And it is a new map of life. We're already seeing these changes occurring. People are getting married much later. They're having children much later. In the UK, you're now more likely as a woman to have a child over 40s than under 20. We're seeing rising divorce rates. The fastest growing age for divorce in the UK is over 80. I can't think of a better statistic to tell me something about longevity than that. But we're also seeing rising participation in the labour market. We're seeing more and more people work beyond the traditional retirement age. It's also about malleability. Now, age is a complicated word. I mean, I can't even agree how to spell the word aging with you, let alone what we mean by it. But, there's different concepts of age. There's chronological age, how many years have we lived? But actually, for me, there's two more important concepts of age. One is prospective age, how many more years have I got to live? And that longer life expectancy, the average Brit has never been so old, but never had so many years left to live. John Chauvin, the former director of SIEPR, did a lot of work on this around age inflation. And if the average Brit has never been so old, but never have so many years left to live, I don't know if I can unambiguously call that an aging society. I'd like to say we're younger for longer, but that might be pushing it a little bit. But we know that age is malleable, and we can also alter how we age in terms of our health. Now, the advances in biological aging are quite phenomenal at the moment, and they're doing extraordinary things in the lab, making it routine to reverse aging in cells. Whether that will ever or when become something that we can benefit from, I have no idea. But we know that there are things we can do to age well. It's in terms of all the things like sleep, eating, exercise, good company, purpose, all of those things we know can affect how we age. So two things: there's more old people, and how our aging is changing. And how can we exploit how we're aging and changing to make it better? This is where I come to what I call a very simple evergreen syllogism. The first thing is, I've just shown you the data. The young and the middle-aged have never had such a high chance of becoming the old or the very old. Secondly, if you talk to people about getting old, they worry about getting old. They worry about getting ill. They worry about outliving their health, their money, their skills, their relationships, their purpose. Put those two things together and you reach the inevitable conclusion: what are you going to do now, whatever your age, to improve the chances that you're actually not going to outlive your health, etc. This is the new evergreen agenda. Health is incredibly important to us, and aging well is now a new health imperative. Now, I was told to say a few things because this isn't just an academic or a policy audience. I'm going to say a bit about business. This is a huge emerging market. Now, the AARP would tell you that I think if you look at the money spent by people aged over 50 in the United States, it's the third biggest economy in the world. That's kind of the silver economy. I'm less keen on that as a concept. I think the over 50 market is so incredibly diverse that you'd get lost trying to find it. It's also, when you hear of things like the silver economy, the statistic often used is in Japan, for instance, they now sell more adult diapers than baby diapers. If I need adult diapers, I'll spend money on them, but I would spend a lot of money to avoid needing them. And that's this evergreen economy. There are few things so important to us than aging well. And so this is something that's going to be an enormous implication across every part of the economy. A health sector that really focuses upon preventative health. An education sector that focuses upon lifelong learning so we can be productive for longer. A financial sector that looks not just at pensions, but thinking about how we can just redistribute money across many different stages of life and deal with the new risks that are arriving of living a very, very long life, of outliving your money. How do we deal with longevity risk rather than dying in middle age? Then, of course, there's the food industry, there's the leisure industry. This evergreen economy, I think, is enormous. And of course, the irony of talking about longer lives is I'm running out of time, so I'm going to quickly try and speed up. But this is a very new moment in human history. Because when most of the diseases affect young children, we focus our medical efforts on infant mortality. When we succeed, and now most of illnesses and death come in midlife, we focus our attentions on midlife mortality. Now, of course, given those survival rates, we have to focus on age-related diseases. But what's really interesting, this is some work I did in a Nature paper with David Sinclair and Martin Ellison, is the better we get at aging, the more we want to age more. If we're going to be ill in our 90s, we don't want to reach our 90s ill. If we can get there healthy, we're going to push it even further. This is a take-off moment for humanity. We've never had such high incentives to age well because we've never had such a high probability of becoming old. We need to invest much more in our future, whether it be us as individuals or governments, to maximize our chances of aging well. This is something that's never been relevant before for society, but it is now. And so we have to achieve a three-dimensional longevity dividend. We've already got these longer lives. They may get even longer, who knows, but we've already got these long lives. But we've really got to make them healthier for longer. We've got to compress morbidity and make sure health span matches up with lifespan. The numbers I've done, the economic benefits of that are phenomenal. But of course, if we're living longer, we've also got to be productive for longer. And that's not just about increasing the state pension age. That just makes things add up financially. It doesn't mean that you're still going to be employed after 50. Employment starts to fall from 50 for a whole bunch of reasons. We've got to make sure that people remain productive for longer. This is a great audience that's already benefiting from a three-dimensional longevity dividend, but we need a lot more public policy and private sector initiatives to ensure that everyone can do it. Because if we live longer lives that are healthy and productive, we don't have an aging society. We have a healthy society benefiting from longer lives. Thank you.
So thank you both for your really fascinating presentations, and So given that this is a SIEPR summit, I'm going to focus my questions on sort of policy implications of what you've presented. So let me start with you, Aysegul. You showed these trends in the labor force participation rate, and as you said, a lot of it was largely predictable. Now, part of why people get confused about this is that the labor force is defined as everybody above 16, and if we forget for a minute the longevity ability maybe to work really late in life, it seems like it's maybe not the most obvious way of defining labor force participation, and so we end up kind of stuck with the wrong statistics. So do you think that there's an issue maybe with what our headline numbers are, and that we should be focusing on other numbers when reporting on labor force participation?
Great question, Adrien. Actually, when I first started working at the Fed, I was told that you look at prime age men's unemployment rate because that's the best indicator. And we no longer think that way because prime age men's labor force attachment actually declined a lot in the last 20 years. So other countries do it in a different way. UK, for example, publishes the activity rate, which is for 16 to 64-year-olds. That's probably easier if you have a clear retirement age. But what has been happening with the baby boom cohort aging is that people started to work longer. And actually, this cohort pushed against this downward trend for a very long time. So if we just look at 16 to 64 or 25 to 55, we will miss this intensive margin adjustment. So there are pros and cons of both approach, but I think keeping a close eye on demographic structure, but still sticking to the aggregate will probably be easier still.
So that's really interesting. So one of the things that's been happening in the labor market since COVID is there's been this really kind of this big decline in labor force participation and then a recovery. And there's a big question among at the Federal Reserve and other places on how tight is the labor market right now. And people are looking at the participation rate and they're saying, oh, it's below what it used to be. But how much of this is the labor market is just affected by demographics? And so in your reading, what would you say is the labor market right now? Is it, is it a tight labor market despite the low participation? Or is there something else that had to do with COVID maybe that means that?
I mean, I think participation rate was the most puzzling indicator after COVID. Mm-hmm. And it probably affected the Fed's decision to wait a bit longer because it really looked like it was going to come back up. But if you look at the data carefully, it shouldn't have stayed at that level even in the absence of the pandemic. Right now, we have a very tight labor market, but I still don't expect the participation to go back to where it was. I mean, again, you have your skinny jeans that you were wearing before, but it's no longer going to fit. That's why I think it's really important to understand this trend was happening even pre-pandemic. And we shouldn't benchmark ourselves with this pre-pandemic or pre-recession levels, especially in light of these important trends.
So let me switch to the part of your presentation that was about the startup rate. And so we've seen this big decline in the startup rate. And that's part of what the literature has been calling the declining dynamism. And so there's concerns, but you mentioned, okay, is it an opportunity or a challenge? So what do you see as the implications of this declining startup rate for productivity and growth? And in the end, do you side more on the opportunity or the challenge side of this?
I mean, if you look at productivity by firm age, there's so much selection at the startup and young firm level that productivity peaks after a couple of years and then it starts declining. So if you have low firm birth, you don't get this productivity kick from young firms. So an aging firm age distribution is consistent with lower productivity growth. And when we look at the last 20 years, we see big increases in firm age, worker age, and that's where we also see productivity slow down. So that's really the negative effect of aging that comes from the declining startup rates in the US economy.
So I guess I have a broad question that applies actually to both of you, which is what do you see as the implications of this demographic change for the labor market broadly? Like, what do you see? Do you think that the nature of work is changing? Maybe do you think that this is mostly affecting firms' investment? So where in the labor market and more broadly in the macroeconomy do you think that we should be looking for implications of aging?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting that 10 years before COVID, 75% of US employment growth was from workers aged over 55. And that's a combination of a large cohort coming through and then being more likely to work. So, employment growth, forget out productivity for now, but employment growth is going to be more and more driven by what happens to participation rates at older ages. And what I think has been really interesting, as you mentioned, Aysegul, is after COVID, suddenly the behavior of older workers, they've sort of withdrawn a little bit faster, I think, than people thought after COVID, and it became a first-order macroeconomic issue. Inflation and unemployment was being driven by this decision. So I think governments are beginning to focus on this group a lot more. From my work, a couple of things have been happening. The first is, work is becoming more age-friendly. So if you look at the things that older workers prefer to have in a job, that are things that will encourage them to work for longer, things they like more than even younger people, it's things like less physical work, more flexible work, more autonomy. Jobs are becoming more flexible. So that's great. And then, I think what you are seeing as retirement increases, the trend of the 20th century was more leisure after retirement. I think the trend of the 21st century would be more leisure this side of retirement. So part-time working, et cetera, would be important. But I think what you're also seeing in the labour market, if I dig around with some work on at the moment, is the labour market's actually working quite well for lots of older workers. But there's some challenges for younger workers. It's not that they're losing their jobs, but it's that they're not getting the higher wage jobs they used to get at an earlier age. So we've actually got quite a complicated labour market in the moment where it's working very well actually for older workers, whether they're college or non-college, but it's not working well at younger ages. So there's a lot of issues here, but how we do two things. How do we get people to work for longer in a way that's good for them and productive? But secondly, how do we then manage the intergenerational workforce? Those two key things. Because your point about startups being important for innovation and productivity growth, there's a lovely research article by a Stanford professor that shows that, yes, young academics, young career academics write the most innovative papers, but the best, most innovative papers come from when you've got a combination of a young scholar and someone more mature, I think is the word. And how we get that combination working is going to be really important.
So it's interesting what you're saying about participation at older ages. In France right now, there's a labor market reform that they're trying to push out the retirement age. And one of the things that is in the public policy debate is it looks like it's really hard to keep the old workers around. And so I assume that there's heterogeneity across countries in this phenomenon. Certainly in France, that's a big part of why there's pushback against moving the retirement age to 64 from 62 where it is currently. So I wonder if you've studied this from a cross-country perspective.
Yeah, and of course the trick all countries do is try and sort of pre-announce way ahead increases in the state pension age. So I think if you're Danish and 20, you're told your state pension age is 70. So pre-announcing reform is important. I think that what's happening. I mean, France has always struggled with this because it's got one of the lowest participation rates for older workers. And I think that the proportion of French men aged over 65 reached 1% in the mid-1990s. I mean, that's a very, very low number. It's probably Francois Mitterrand, I suspect, was the person. But you're starting to see it increase, but it's increasing very, very slowly. But I have some sympathy for the protests. One, because obviously, you want to carry on with retirement. But for me, governments are making a very big mistake. They're indexing it to life expectancy. And that's got two problems. One is there's just a lot of inequality, not so much in France, but the UK is also about to announce a change to the state pension age. And average life expectancy is not what's happening for everyone. And we know that in the US, where there's terrible declines in life expectancy in some groups. So if you just keep raising it for the average, you're wiping out retirement for some. The second is that from an economic point of view, when I play around with theoretical models, it's healthy life expectancy that really determines how long you can work for. So I kind of wish governments would index the state pension age on healthy life expectancy, because then it would also give them an incentive to spend more money in making sure we have better health as we age, rather than at the moment, which is sort of the notion that health expenditure in older people isn't economically productive. So I think that's a really key thing for me. That seems fairer.
So I have a broader question on your evergreen agenda. So I think that you have a fairly provocative view for the literature, which I'd say that summarize the literature as the Modigliani hypothesis, where at each age we tend to do certain things and say when we're 50, we're in the peak of our working age, and then at 60, 65, we start retiring. And so that has big implications for how we think about aggregate savings, aggregate labor force participation, and so on. And you have what I feels like a more benign view, where you say, well, actually, we can stretch life to longer. We can work longer, and so, for instance, we don't need to save as much maybe when we're young, because we know that we're going to be working for longer. So what are the kind of the ways in which your view differs in terms of implications for policies from the regular or the more standard view that comes from a Modigliani type?
So let me tell you a little bit about how I got into this subject. One was I was just getting a bit bored talking about interest rates and fiscal policy, which is interesting about life progression anyway. I had my own mid-career shift. But I would give a lecture a lecture course at London Business School called World Economy, Problems and Prospects. These days, there's a lot more problems than prospects, but it was more balanced then. But I would give a talk about an aging society. And it's doom and gloom. It's like there's more older people. Older people are a problem. They get ill. They need a pension. They're dependents. And then, I forget, the second or third time I gave it, there's a chart in the middle of my lecture which showed that on average, we're living longer and we're healthier for longer. And you go, how have we made this into a bad story? I mean, I know economics is a dismal science, but that's pretty dismal. And then, of course, it's because of two things. First, we focus on a change in the age structure of the population. We don't think about changes in how we age. And then the second thing, and perhaps not all cultures are the same, but certainly the UK and US and economists are like it, is we underestimate the capacity of older people. And so put those two things together, you get the old age dependency ratio, which is a kind of an extraordinary concept in so many ways. And then you start thinking of core economics, which is that, if I'm 57 and I've got much more years ahead of me than my grandfather's generation, it's not that 57's the new 40, it's just 57's the new 57. And every economic principle would tell you if you've got more time ahead of you, you're going to invest more in the future. And that's going to be about health, it's going to be about education, it's going to be about relationships, it's going to be about so many different things. But, just as over time we have arrived at the Modigliani life cycle theory, if I read the 20th century, we invented two stages of life in the 20th century. We invented teenagers and we invented pensioners. My father was born in 1925. He was never a teenager. He literally wasn't. I think the New Yorker introduces the word teenager in 1937 or something. He went to work at 14. And now, of course, we're seeing all sorts of changes in the life cycle happen. So it's about adjusting the life cycle to make the best use of these longer years. I think one of the challenges for economics is we don't have a good theory of aging. That's because in economics, we rather like to have stable preferences. So we have an infinite consumer, which means that there's no theory of age. You should do the same thing all the time. So if you then want to explain how people age differently, we have to have health. But we assume that decline is built into it, and we don't tend to think, how can we change that? And I think what's so interesting, look at growth literature in emerging economies, there's an assumption that investing in health and education is good for GDP growth. But there's not that assumption that also holds for later years. And I think that's wrong.
So one final question on this agenda related to health spending. So we've seen very large increases in, say, health spending to GDP ratio in the US and many other countries, and part of this is because we're getting older, and so we need more, health spending as we get older. In your view, I understand the evergreen agenda is about investing in health more in order to live longer, but then maybe that prevents some of the diseases later on. Do you think, first, broadly, do you think health spending to GDP is going to continue on an upward trend, or is the nature of health spending going to change?
I do think the health to GDP ratio will carry on increasing. I mean, it's not quite the US has got such a high level, but I've looked at international trends. I think so, because there are a few things as important to us as health. And I think Robert Fogel said we should treat this as a sign of our success as a society, that we can create the resources, that we can spend more of our income in generating better health. So if we can get a three-dimensional longevity dividend so we can raise GDP, I think we'll spend a greater proportion on health. I think the challenge we've got at the moment is that we're sort of spending more and more money not keeping people healthy, but treating them when they've got diseases. And so that shift towards preventative health has to be key. And as I say, we'll spend a lot to keep healthy. I would rather we spent that money achieving better health outcomes. Now, you don't want a Brit to tell the Americans about good health outcomes because we don't spend enough and you spend too much, but both of us don't really achieve good outcomes. So how do we do that, I think, is going to be an enormous change. Currently, a lot of the health system gets paid for interventions rather than prevention. But the other thing that changes with keeping people healthy is the health system shifts out of hospitals into clinics, but also into the food you eat, into the way you design public spaces and your public transport systems. So suddenly health becomes a lot more than just what happens in a hospital. That's very complicated. And as I say, we've never had this challenge before as humanity. So it's going to be an enormous change. But I think we need to spend a rising proportion of income, but making sure we get better health outcomes.
So a final question to both of you before we open up for Q&A from the audience. So obviously here we're at an institution of higher education, and demographic change has implications for universities as well, because we're, as the fraction of the population that's older increases, the fraction of the population that's in age of going to college falls. And so Stanford is probably immune to this trend, but certainly other education institutions aren't. So how do you see the implications of demographic change for universities, and maybe the likelihood that we have a job in 50 years?
Well, as I mentioned, in 1980, for every 50-year-old, there were 2 20-year-olds. Now it's 1-to-1. So it's clearly very different. What I want to emphasize is that the rise in college enrollment mostly came from women. We reached parity in 1980. Now, for the ratio of women to men is 1.3. Yet we still have gender wage gap. We have between observationally equivalent workers by gender. We have the same gaps by race. And we know that when students enter the labor market with student loans, they are less likely to become homeowners. They're less likely to pursue risky but high-paying careers. They're less likely to have kids. So there are all these things that are still at the background. I mean, I know there's demographic change, but there's still other margins I think we can push college attendance forward.
Well, I mean, from a longevity perspective, it certainly can put some pressure on the tenure system. So there's some challenges there. But, I think it's really interesting we mentioned here at Stanford. Of course, Phil Pizzo, who was the dean of the Stanford Medical School, has launched here a program that's rolling out now nationwide, the Distinguished Career Initiative, which is getting people to go back to college for a one-year program where they learn, they mix with undergraduates, they have courses about what comes next and how to keep fit and healthy and engaged. And I think that's a fantastic idea because, clearly we're going to have to think about lifelong learning if we're working for longer. And, I've enjoyed enormously coming into a new discipline and learning. So we're going to have to create opportunities to do that. And for universities, what a wonderful business opportunity. You focus on 18 to 26 or something, and it's like, oh, wow, there's all these other people as well. I think what will be interesting is, I think the market's going to expand for education, but there'll be new products emerging. So I think it's Georgia Tech who now say, well, if you've got lifelong learning, why have a distinction between grads and alumni? You can come for 2 years, drop out, come back later and do some extra courses. And I think that's kind of quite an interesting perspective. But, not all education needs to be a 4-year program. Some education you're going to do on YouTube, some's going to be done over a weekend. So I think you're going to see, and you're seeing in the ed tech sector already, a plethora of new firms and products beginning to emerge, which will start to be outside of universities. And how universities interact with our system is going to be really interesting.
Great, so thanks so much. So we have 5 minutes for questions.
Hi, very interesting panel and presentation. I'm Jeanette Garrity. I'm thinking back to something that Condi said in the first session, then talking about free trade, and she said not everybody is impacted equally by the great was impacted equally by the great excitement in the economics profession over free trade. I'm an economist, I'm a card-carrying free trade believer, right? It comes with the territory. But as you alluded to, Andrew, how do you all three think this kind of presentation, this kind of discussion about longevity plays in an audience that doesn't look like this one? And I think you know what I'm referencing. Because do you think everybody's going to be equally excited about the idea of working longer and being enabled to work longer?
I can make a start. No, of course they're not going to be. And of course, I'm not sure everyone in this room is excited about it either. But, and you know, one of the problems with economics is we look at employment. But I think everyone would want to be engaged in some way. So it's not just about paid work, it's also about how we have a social role. And of course, the great problem, I think, with globalization has been a bunch of people who had both an income and a social role that's been denied from them. So I think, you know, that's the key. So no, I mean, clearly, unless we do very major changes in how we... So first of all, right now, we're not on course for everyone to have a longer life. And, you know, in the US, the life expectancy gap between the top 10% income and the bottom 10% is 10 years. In London, where I live, there's North Kensington and South Kensington. They're cheek by jowl. The difference in life expectancy is 14 years. That's just extraordinary. That tells us that aging is malleable. So, you know, individual behaviors are important, but your social environment is absolutely key. So that's an enormous government policy agenda, one of which governments took up when they looked at reducing infant mortality and providing free education to everyone. So I think we need to do something like that at later life for across the board.
And one thing I want to emphasize is as we get older, it demands services that are more labor intensive. So as a result, not only we start losing workers, even if they work longer, at some point they need labor intensive services, then that puts pressure on the working age population. And that's why part of automation is coming as a response to deal with aging societies. So automation is definitely accelerate as aging accelerates as well, because we are putting much more strain on the working age population by demanding the services. And I think we started seeing more of this after the pandemic as well. Part of it is responsible for the labor shortages that we are seeing.
Oh, and then a question over there.
So along with the aging of the population, one of the big things that our society is going to be dealing with is climate change. In many instances, having a smaller population would make climate change actions a little bit easier. Can you talk a little bit about the intersection of those two things?
Everyone's give me, okay, yeah, I will. So there's a bunch of this. There's number of people, and then there's also some arguments about who's keen. I'm suggesting people should be healthier for longer. I think, you know, we don't say we shouldn't intervene around cancer, et cetera, because it's going to lead to a large population. So I think getting people to be healthy for longer is important. Actually, having a better environment is going to be really key to doing that, because the environment is increasingly going to be a challenge around health issues. And, you know, in some parts of the world, population growth is not going to be the big challenge. It's going to be a falling population because the fertility rates are so low. I mean, for me, the key thing is to make sure we have a sustainable lifestyle. And so, you know, if every individual has a sustainable lifestyle, whether we have 7 million or 8 billion is not the key issue. So it's getting to that level of sustainability that is key. So personally, if you look at the projections for the population, it's really the birth rate that drives the population growth. Unless we have, you know, radical life expectancy extensions and people live to 500, I don't think this thing about living longer and healthier really makes that first order impact on the environment, which is not to reduce the importance of achieving sustainability. The other thing, by the way, which I rather hope is that if we do have longer lives, we're all going to have to take a much longer term perspective on things. I think that's a really big challenge we're going to face because we're not very good at it. But of course, climate change is not just a long run problem, but a short run problem. But I do hope that we'll start to take that long-term perspective. I think it's The Leopard, the novel The Leopard, where the Count says, I only care for those that I will meet. Well, if you're going to meet 4 generations in your household, you have a lot more responsibility about making sure that you look after the world.
Okay, so we'll take one more question and then break for lunch.
Hi, Professor Scott. How's it going? I'm a student. I'm probably on the younger side compared to everybody. And because of this, I read your article with David Sinclair on like the potentialities of the impact of like metformin on increasing life expectancy. And I was wondering, let's say potentially we could live 20 years longer or 30 years longer. What are some interesting effects of that on economic effects of that?
Yeah, so the article on metformin, I'm not here to advocate metformin. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to tell you anything on that. And I don't think there's any evidence that there's anything around right now that will give you 30 more years of life. What the point of that paper was saying was that actually so many diseases now have aging as their main risk factor. Cardiovascular disease, pulmonary diseases, arthritis, dementia, diabetes. So we can age better biologically. If there's one thing, there's some things we can do that slow down aging, you have a huge effect across a lot of diseases, and that's worth a large amount of money. That's worth huge amounts to us in economic terms, lots and lots of dollars. I always get slightly nervous about talking about 20 or 30 years of extra life because it's not on the cards, but it's sort of what's happened over the past. That's what we've gained. So, what do we gain? We gain, if they're in good health, we gain more time. We get more predictability in how we live. We can do more things. It's obviously a major adjustment to how we have to think. So lots of ways we currently do, like ageism and discounting later years, is a challenge. But if we do see those dramatic increases in life expectancy, we restructure the life course and use it as an opportunity. I say, if I asked most people in the room, would you like to have more time in which you're in good health? I think the answer is yes, it's incredibly valuable. There's some debate about, if we live to 500, will we get bored? But I don't really think that's the challenge that we're facing at the moment.
We have Netflix.
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks so much. I guess Mark is here for closing our panel.
Thank you so much to Adrien, Aysegul, and Andrew. AAA. Thank you, AAA.